Welcome to OAC Vancouver's podcast. Thank you for tuning in. We believe that Jesus is needed and relevant for people in Vancouver today. The message of God's love and promise of wholeness was destined to be experienced within a faith community that worships, studies scripture, and prays together. We warmly welcome you to journey with us towards greater connection, purpose, and peace. We'll be sharing our recorded services and conversations with health and wellness experts. Enjoy.
Hi, and welcome to the OAC Vancouver podcast. This is our series to begin to know our church members. Welcome, Memory and Eugene.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
So, what did you eat for breakfast?
Yes, so it's quite strange, this COVID thing, because some cereals are not available at the supermarket. Like there's no cornflakes, there's no brown flakes, and maybe a few others. So what I'm resorting to is to kind of, just make a cereal cocktail of whatever is available. That's what I had.
It's funny. Well, I don't eat breakfast. So I had black coffee. That's usually my breakfast.
What profession do you guys both work in?
I work for a law firm, so I work in legal support.
I'm a civil engineer and I work for an engineering consultancy.
How did you guys meet?
We met through mutual friends. We didn't know each other, and our friends thought we would make a good couple, and they kind of introduced us. And I guess we just took it from there. I was a bit skeptical at first when they were describing him and this great guy, blah, 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 blah. So I was like, if he's so great, why is he still single? But, I was curious, and then we kind of just started talking over email. Oh my God, to think about it now, we kind of just started chatting over email, and we kind of just hit it off from day one, really, and we just took it from there.
Was that in Canada where you guys met?
No, this was in the UK. So we moved to Canada from the UK, but we are both originally from Zimbabwe. And so we had moved from Zimbabwe to the UK, but at different times. We didn't know each other from Zimbabwe. So this was still back in the UK before we moved here.
How long were you both in the UK?
Maybe it's a similar amount of time.
Yeah.
About 11 years.
Just curious, where in the UK?
Where? Oh, I went to university in London. So I was in London for like 6 years. And then I moved to the Midlands after university for a few years. And Eugene lived up north. We lived in different cities even then. Eugene lived up north in Leeds. So even when we were dating, we still didn't live in the same city. We lived about a couple of hours from each other.
When you were in the UK, how was the kind of Adventist community compared to like BC, you feel?
Yeah, so this is where it gets interesting for me, because I struggled with church in the UK. Okay. So I guess that means it was different. Or besides growing up in Zimbabwe, I'd also lived in South Africa for a while. Sort of almost like what your mom told you kind of thing. Almost every place I got to, I would look for a church. Okay. And that's what I did when I actually got to Vancouver too and found OAC. When I got to the UK, despite living in 3 different cities, I sort of struggled with church there. I would kind of, go very much on and off. It wasn't the same feeling I got in other places. But on the other hand, I can't really explain why. Maybe in some way, a blessing, that a change of life that brought me here to Vancouver, and they ended up at OAC and sort of back to church in the way I had been going to church before?
Yeah, if for me, it's actually the opposite. I belonged to a great church family, and it wasn't Adventist, interesting enough. It was a Pentecostal church, and it was a group of Zimbabweans who had moved to the UK and started their own church. So it was almost like we were at home. The way we worshipped and the way we did things is similar to what we did in Zimbabwe, and I liked it there. So I no idea what Adventism was at the time, and to be honest, I didn't really care. At the time I enjoyed being a Pentecostal.
So how many years were you both in Zimbabwe?
I was in Zimbabwe until I was 19, 20. Yes, so I didn't live in Zimbabwe very long after high school. So 1920 is when I moved abroad.
Yeah, and I also left Zimbabwe not as young as 19. Let me see, what age was I at the time? I was 23 when after I went to university in Zimbabwe. Then after finishing university, I moved across to South Africa, where I worked for a little while before moving to the UK. So I was born in Zimbabwe, and lived my life there until I was around 23, and then moved to South Africa, and was in South Africa for maybe 4 years, just over 4 years, and then I moved to the UK.
Does Adventism run in your family background for the both of you?
For me, it does. I grew up in the Adventist church. Some of my sort of not really earliest memories for me, but maybe earliest memories for people who knew me in the community are stories of me performing or doing things at church when I was a kid. And I kind of grew into it maybe more by myself by the time I got to sort of Pathfinder's age, because Pathfinders were pretty big where I grew up, and they sort of brought kids together even without sort of their parents taking them to church and so on. There was a lot of fun around being in the Pathfinders, and to some extent a lot of purpose too. And so through Pathfinder's age, many of us actually went to sort of a different church to the one that your parents go to. you kind of congregate to where most of your friends go, and kind of you wake up on a Sabbath morning, and then you go different ways, and you kind of meet back in the evening. Fairly common for many of us. So I kind of grew up like that. And also even at university, the church community there that was strong. And so I grew up kind of in the church and continued trying to find a church, even through my time in the UK, as I explained.
Yeah, I grew up in a Pentecostal household. Like both my parents were Pentecostals, and even when I left home, when I moved to the UK, I found a Pentecostal church, and I was very much Pentecostal. Even when I was dating Eugene, I was very determined that I wasn't going to move over to Adventism, because I really didn't know much about Adventists, and the little that I knew was never anything, I would say, positive, nothing bad, but it wasn't, anything you would say, oh, maybe let me try this, or let me see what it is that they're about. So I was very much a Pentecostal until I got married.
When you guys were beginning to know each other, how did those conversations start coming up about each other's respective faiths?
I think it's a conversation we avoided. Wouldn't you say, Eugene? I think it was not something we discussed, because I knew Eugene was very much Adventist, and there wasn't changing that. And I was very much Pentecostal, and I wasn't prepared also to change that. It's funny how God works. And even though we knew we're both Christians, it was never anything that we discussed to say, going forward, if we could go to the same church, how would that look? Would we be Adventists or would we go this way? So we never really, it's fun in the 4 years that we were dating, it was never really something that we, on my end anyway, I wanted to discuss, because I kind of had an idea of how that conversation would go. You don't agree?
Yeah, I do. I guess it's maybe one of those sort of questions that you ask yourself and you answer to yourself. In the end, maybe what was more overriding was you value being in a relationship with someone who fears God or has a relationship with God, and you at least sort of rejoice in that and know it's something to build on. That's maybe more than anything how I looked at it at the time. You sort of ask yourself, does this mean ever changing from being an Adventist? And you kind of just can think otherwise if for right or wrong, if you have a background like mine, and that's the sort of way it was at the time. And I'm happy, obviously we, where we are now, and it's a happy environment for everyone, including for our kids.
So you both went to, I'm assuming, to the UK for school?
I did. And you did too, right? Initially.
Yeah, initially, yes. Yeah. So I had moved to the UK to take up graduate studies, but at the same time I'd been working for a little while, and I told myself that when I get to the UK, I could also do part-time work in my profession, and when I started looking for that, the lure of going back to work full-time sort of quickly took over, and I went back to work and left the initial graduate studies that I had kind of gone there for. But I went there at a time when the labor market was very much favorable for me.
And then what brought you both to Canada?
Eugene did.
So again, I had each of you at some point, and considering work opportunities outside the UK, and something came up in Canada, and it kind of came together pretty fast and ended up here.
Yeah, and it's funny, at the time we were still dating. We're not married when the job opportunity came up, and so it was kind of a conversation of, so what happens now? I guess that kind of worked itself out for us to get married and move here. Not that we wouldn't have gotten married if we hadn't, but it kind of sped things up, if that makes sense.
So memory, when you started going, I'm assuming at some point in time back then, into the Adventist church, like what was your experience like?
It was nothing like I expected. I had this very traditional view of what being in an Adventist church was. So Eugene had moved here 6 months before I did, and he had found, I guess he just went on Google and he found OAC. It was the closest one to where we were living downtown at the time. And he had come to OAC a couple of times. So when I eventually moved at the beginning of the year, he was like, I found an Adventist church, and let's go check it out and see what you think. So at the time I was like, I'm still going to look for a Pentecostal church, right? But let me just give this one a try and just see, just to satisfy my curiosity. And it was like nothing I expected. I remember when I first my first day there, I remember seeing a band. I think it was Joey and a few young men and ladies who were doing the worship. And I was like, they have bands in an Adventist church, and they were singing, because I had this in Zimbabwe, it's very traditional, you sing from a hymn book, there is no guitars, there is no drums. So I was expecting to be bored, if you know what I mean. But no, it was nothing like that. And they were singing songs I knew. I think it was a Hillsong song. And I was like, oh, they actually do worship music that I know that I can sing along to. And then it came to the word. I don't remember the specific message, but I was like, it's nothing different from what I hear in my church. I was expecting it to be so far out. Then I'll be like, oh, they don't preach Jesus, or they don't preach what I was taught. And it was like, oh, it's the same thing. Why did I think otherwise? So after that first experience, to be honest, I was sold. I was like, okay, I like this. So I came back and I came back. And I guess I never left. Yeah.
It was the first Adventist church you went to in OAC?
Yeah, it was the very first time I went to an Adventist church. No, actually, no. When I was about 12, I think, I have a cousin back in Zimbabwe who is Adventist. Her family they were not Adventists or even Christians, but she was, I think she became an Adventist through school. So when I visited once, she took me to an Adventist church. At the time I was 12, so I didn't really grasp or have any concept of what was going on. But I remember a very traditional service, with the hymn books, and everyone was much older than me, and I didn't really relate to it. So that was my first memory of an Adventist church. But yeah, OAC was like my first real experience as an adult of an Adventist church.
Yeah, I'm sure Robert and Joey will be happy to hear that. Yeah. How old are your kids again?
8 and 2.
Like, did you have conversations about how to raise the kids?
I think the conversation never really came up in a sort of formal way, because by the time we were pregnant with our first, I already knew that OAC is where I was going to raise the kids. It was never a conversation to say, oh, so how are we raising the kids? Are they Pentecostals or are they Adventists? So it was never really a conversation. It was just by the time we had children, we were already in a way, I was already an Adventist. So it was never really a conversation.
Yeah, and if I can add something which maybe some people may find odd about us and OAC, or me and OAC, considering that I kind of had been to many churches growing up and many Adventist churches growing up, and that there are also many Adventist churches in Vancouver, in the Vancouver area. One sort of strange thing is that since moving to Vancouver, except for one day when we were very late, or we actually kind of got blocked by traffic and so on, and we ended up in one of the other churches, I've actually never kind of gone to any of our other sort of branches. So it's sort of an extension to our home in a very big way, that you realize it more when you look back, that it's sort of been over 9 years now, us living in Vancouver, and we've never sort of had the discussion, not that it would be wrong, but we've never had the discussion, why don't we go to another of kind of our church branches around here? It's very much our home, and so in terms of the kids growing up there, and sort of how we look to the community, and also to some extent feed off the community in raising the kids. OAC is that much our home.
From a lot of the many churches that what do you feel stand out as what makes things welcoming? Because we've all been to places which are more welcoming and maybe a little bit less welcoming. But I guess reflecting on kind of a lot of your experiences, what do you feel makes something welcoming?
Yeah, it's hard to describe, okay? But there is, some there's a different, call it welcoming air that you feel in different places. And that's not sort of judging the people in those places where you sort of feel slightly less welcome than elsewhere. But it's, in my case, something to be said about OAC, whether it's from the moment you walk in, the range in age groups and the range in sort of people background, if I may say that, in that you see Black people, you see Asian people, you see call it white people together, and then you get this feeling that it's something else that brings people there. Okay, it's not people there because they are hanging out with people of the same age, or it's not kind of people there because they are hanging out with their fellow country folk, or it's not people there because they are hanging out with people of this or that kind of similar background. Okay, so there's that to it. Okay, as you then start to participate or venture into some of the church's activities, there's a broad range to sort of appeal to whatever appeals to you most. Okay, in my case, it's it was probably more the opportunity to volunteer and sort of serve on some of the community outreach sort of projects at the time, and to sort of have that type of thing bring people together on a midweek evening. I found that appealing. You have this or that other similar background. It was just, oh, we are here to serve, and I think that it's many things that are along that theme that appeal to me about OAC.
Yeah, I think I also feel the same way, that, like you were saying, it's not like you are going to a OAC to hang out with your fellow countrymen. Like the church that I used to belong to, it was 99% Zimbabweans, and we were all of a similar age group, right? People who had moved around the same time from Zimbabwe to the U and found themselves, new immigrants in the UK. So we had very much a lot in common that brought us together to form a church. But with OAC, it was different. It was, I'd never been to a multicultural church like that, and multi-generational. There was, young families, parents of teenagers, older people. So that side of things appealed to me, like it was, I went out to hang out with, I get to learn from different people from different backgrounds. And I really enjoy that even up to this day.
That's interesting you guys are saying that, because I came from a church that was 99% Vietnamese, and going to OEC. I just realized moving here is like, I don't know anymore. I don't know any Vietnamese people anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
But it's like it's not that I don't miss out, but I don't feel there's a void, because OEC is so diverse. I actually enjoyed kind of getting to know a lot of different viewpoints and cultures, which I didn't have before.
Yeah.
When it was just all Vietnamese people. Yeah.
True.
Kind of a tough question, but when you consider you had a lot of cultural experiences, how do you define what home is?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question. I like that you've sort of asked a question that I've asked myself too, in that if you've moved away from sort of the traditional definition of home, okay, where it's like, okay, this is the household that I grew up in, and 10 minutes away is where my uncles are, and 15 minutes away is where my aunts are, and 30 minutes away is kind of where all my cousins are, and so on. If you are transplanted from kind of that situation, your definition of home then gradually changes. Okay, not that you lose that very core and true definition of home. Your definition of home starts to change, and you ask yourself that question as you move around, and so I actually did ask myself kind of that question a little bit when I was in the UK, to say, can I call this home now? And what do I mean by that? Okay, there are many things that maybe could be happening that you may try to attach to that definition, but ultimately, I don't say it lightly when I say kind of OAC felt like home, especially when I kind of reference my kids growing up in that environment. There is something about home that's just about, you may not share the same background in terms of you're from the same place, you share the same last name like many cultures do, but it becomes about values and about openness. Okay, and if you are around people who you truly share the same values with, and who are open to you, okay, and by open to you, especially people who are maybe not necessarily your own age, maybe if you've got older people than you around you who are sort of open and accommodating to you, then you start to feel at home. And to me, that's sort of a little bit of the shift that has happened with me over time, and maybe more specifically with my time at OAC.
Yeah, I don't think I can add anything to what he's just said. He said exactly what I was thinking, to what I feel I define home as. Like he said, I have struggled too with defining what home or where home is. But after having kids, and I feel like where I am raising my kids, where I'm starting my own traditions, the church that I take my kids to every Sabbath morning is where it feels like home the most. And OAC has been that for my family over the years.
Thanks for sharing that. Do you have any particular faith-defining moments in your life?
I've also, this is one of the other things that I've struggled with a bit, okay, in that many people I know, okay, and especially kind of within kind of the church, or within sort of a Christian setting, are people who would have had at some point, maybe a calling of some sort, okay, be it sort of a major event, or maybe when at some point in time they felt or they know they were sort of very much on the wrong path, and they sort of reached a point where they kind of made a U-turn or turned right. Okay, I don't have an event quite like that in my life, and I've in a way sort of struggled with it to sort of say, is it a problem, or is it is it complete? that I don't have, quite a big event like that. So I have answered to your question. In my case, I don't have a largely sort of defining moment. Okay. I maybe have had a defining walk or period in my life that I maybe attribute some of my current faith and where I am to. And old as I may be, it's funny that if I kind of look back, I probably would say the defining times for me were kind of, in my early teens and sort of through kind of growing up in the Pathfinder movement. Later on in life, looked back many times and sort of seen that the friends that I got through that, the lessons here and there, whether direct or indirect, that I got through my time in kind of growing up in the church that way is maybe the most life defining for me.
I think for me, also nothing grand like that. But I think for me, the most significant point in my walk was me accepting Jesus for myself, as somebody who was raised by Christians. You are raised in a family that goes to church, right? So it's just second nature to wake up on a Sunday morning and go to church and read the Bible, or you learn hymns. So as in my late teens, early 20s, I think when I moved from home, I had to make that decision for myself to go to church. I had to make that decision. My mom wasn't forcing me because I grew up in a very strict household that you had to go to church on a Sunday morning, right? But after I left home, I didn't have anyone waking me up on a Sunday morning to say, hey, it's time for church. So it was easy for me to just be like, I'm tired. I work, I go to school now. Sunday morning is my time to just rest, right? But I think the moment for me was discovering Jesus for myself and not the Jesus that my parents worshipped. It's the same Jesus, but I was just going to church because that's what we do in our household, right? But just discovering Jesus for myself and having that relationship that's independent from my parents, I think that was a defining moment for me.
Yeah, that's the thing I think a lot of us struggle through. Like, I think we all were forced to go to church at some point in time just because we're kids and we had to go. You don't have a choice when you're much earlier.
Exactly.
But there's a point that stops. And discovering, I like how you say discovering Jesus for yourself is something that sometimes I think parents need to reflect on more, right? As they go through the journey. What are some hobbies that you both have that nobody knows about?
The one thing for me that I think of right now, I don't know if it's so much a hobby, but I have recently discovered true crime documentaries. I can't get enough of them. Like they are so morbid, you know what I mean? It's just these gruesome murders, and these are true stories. They are not fiction, right? And I can't stop watching them. I'm so fascinated by the psychology of a criminal, just the criminal mind. It is, I know I have to stop at some point. It's just getting out of hand. But that's the one thing that I would say is a hobby, quote unquote. I don't know if I would call that a hobby, but it's something that I've been getting into lately. I think it's just being stuck at home and, that's making it that. But yeah.
Yes, you need to go back to the office.
I do. Or maybe I should have been a criminal lawyer, Then I would work with these people every day.
Wow,
That would satisfy my curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, I've had hobbies come and go over time, but one that seems to have stuck over the last few years is cooking and sort of experimenting with different types of stuff and just being adventurous, and that's what I do. Even Lucas, my 8-year-old son, sort of now joins in the fun every now and then, and we make stuff and force everyone to eat.
And force me to clean up afterwards.
Wait, so Eugene, before you came on, Memory and I were talking about soup, and I was just saying it's so cold. I'm just cooking soup all the time now. But in Zimbabwean culture, is soup not a common dish?
Not really, no. Not that I can say I explored Zimbabwean cuisine a lot. Besides what kind of was just cooked in my household, but I think in Zimbabwean cuisine, it's mostly you don't have a soup, but you have a stew or a sauce that goes with carbohydrate of some sort. Okay, so actually the word the same word that we use for soup is also the same word that we use for kind of sauce and stew, because it's more of what you use it for than sort of the different types of soup that maybe you are referring to.
Yeah.
Is there like a national dish in Zimbabwe, or like the most popular dish that it's known for?
Oh yeah, there is. So pretty much everyone eats sort of a cornmeal. It's not exactly a porridge. It's like a thick porridge, like thick polenta. Okay, which you sort of then maybe change, from meal to meal what goes with it. Maybe a chicken stew, a beef stew, or milk, and so on and so on. So it's very much a staple, the maize meal sort of side of the thick porridge.
Yeah, and growing up, we ate a lot of beef. Now that I think of it, I'm like, how did we survive that much beef? Pretty much every other day you would eat a meal with beef. Now that I think of it, it's like, oh my God, my mind is blown by it. But yeah, we are meat eaters.
Yeah, very much so. Very much.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for the time tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
This was such a fun conversation.
Thank you for listening to OAC Vancouver's podcast. Learn more at oacvancouver.ca. If you're in Vancouver, join us for worship Saturdays at 11 a.m. at 5350 Bailey Street. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and subscribe. God bless you and have a wonderful day.